The candle burns softly now. Its flame bends and straightens, breathing in rhythm with the night. And somewhere beyond the window, a slow wind drifts through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and the last blossoms of summer. You can take a deep breath and let the world grow a little quieter. Let your shoulders loosen and let your thoughts slow, like leaves settling on still water. The story begins a very long time ago, so long ago that the roads were only soft lines between meadows, and the bells in small stone chapels still called people from far hills. It was an age of quiet wonder, when time moved slower, and people spoke in low voices so as not to disturb the peace of the land. In that time, in a valley between two sleeping forests, there was a small village called Marindale. It was known for its apples and for its gentle light. Travelers said that even the mist seemed kind there, the kind that rose each morning, wrapping cottages in silver and hiding the world just enough to make it beautiful. The people of Marindale lived simple lives. They baked bread that smelled of honey and rye. They tended to sheep with soft white wool, and in the evenings they sat on benches before their doors, listening to the frogs and the slow, steady ticking of crickets. There were no great lords nearby, no battles or feasts of gold, only peace and the rhythm of the seasons. In one of the cottages by the brook lived an old woman named Alenia. Her hair had gone the color of frost, but her eyes were clear and deep, like the surface of a calm pond. She had once been the village healer, gathering herbs by moonlight and mixing them into teas that soothed both body and heart. People still came to her sometimes, not for medicine, but for stories. For Alenia's stories were said to bring sleep even to restless souls. One evening, when the moon was a pale half-circle in a lavender sky, a young shepherd knocked on her door. His name was Taran, and though his hands were rough from work, his voice was gentle, almost hesitant. "Mother Alenia," he said softly, "my heart has grown too full of thoughts. I can't sleep. They say you have a tale that eases the mind." Alenia smiled. She motioned for him to come inside. Her home smelled of herbs, old wood, and the faint smoke of drying lavender. She poured him a small cup of warm milk, sprinkled with honey and a few crushed petals of rose. Then she said, "Sit by the fire, my boy. I'll tell you a tale as old as the hills, about how they once chose a wife." The fire crackled softly, and outside the crickets continued their endless song. And so, as the young man closed his eyes, the old woman began. Long ago, before the church bell of Marindale was cast, and before the first road was laid across the valley, there lived a young nobleman named Edrin of Glenwick. He was neither proud nor vain, only quiet, thoughtful, and often alone. His father had been a knight, and his mother, a woman of grace who loved to walk among her gardens until twilight. When both had passed, the young Edrin was left with their small manor, 2 loyal servants, and the company of the hills that folded around him like old friends. For years, he rode each day through meadows and forests, tending to his lands, listening to the hum of bees, and watching the streams shimmer beneath the sunlight. The people nearby spoke well of him, that he never took more than he needed, that he shared his harvest in lean seasons, and that he often paused to listen when others spoke. But time, like the steady river, moved on. And as he reached his 30th summer, whispers began to drift through the valley, gentle ones, like the rustling of dry wheat. Lord Edrin should choose a wife, the villagers said. His home is large, his hearth is cold. A kind woman would bring laughter back to the manor. Yet Edrin did not rush. He had seen how quickly people changed when gold or title gleamed before them. He wished, instead, for someone whose heart was quiet like his own, someone who would walk with him at dusk without needing to speak, who would listen to rain as though it were music. One autumn evening, when the first fires of harvest were burning in the fields, he climbed the hill beyond his lands and sat beneath an old oak tree. The leaves were beginning to fall, spinning slowly to the earth. He closed his eyes and thought, "How will I know who she is, if ever she comes?" And just then, the wind shifted, soft and warm. It carried with it the scent of baked apples and wood smoke, and the faintest echo of laughter from the village below. Edrin smiled. "Perhaps," he whispered to the wind, "she will find me, if I wait long enough. He did not know that his wish had been heard, not by any god nor saint, but by the quiet spirit of the land itself. For in those days, when the world still dreamed between dusk and dawn, the old spirits of meadows and waters still listened to the hearts of men. The next morning, the manor awoke to the scent of dew and bread. The kitchen maid, a rosy-cheeked girl named Lena, hummed as she kneaded the dough. The stable boy brushed the horses until their coats gleamed like bronze. The air felt different, calm, yet expectant, as though something gentle was about to arrive. And indeed, not long after, a traveler appeared at the gate. She was a young woman, dressed in a simple cloak of gray-blue wool. Her boots were dusted from the road, and her hair was the color of honey in sunlight. She carried a small basket filled with herbs and apples. "I am on my way to the southern hills," she said to the guard. "But I heard this manor has an orchard. Might I rest a while?" Idrin, hearing voices, came to the courtyard. He saw the traveler, and something in her calmness stilled him. She bowed slightly. "Good day, my lord. My name is Alara. I've walked far, and your trees look kinder than the road." "Then rest," Idrin said. "Kindness is meant to be shared." She smiled, and though it was a small smile, it was like sunlight breaking through mist. He offered her water, bread, and a place in the garden to sit. There they spoke for a little while, of apples, of the scent of rain, and of how quiet the nights were in the valley. Her voice was soft, as if each word had been chosen with care. She said she gathered herbs for healing, that she loved to walk alone in forests because trees, unlike people, always listened. Idrin found her words stayed with him even after she left. That night, the wind rose again, curling around the windows of the manor. It whispered through the halls and stirred the candles. Idrin stood at the open door, looking out at the stars. He thought of Alara's quiet eyes, the scent of rosemary that lingered when she spoke, and the way the light had touched her hands as she held an apple. And though he did not yet know it, that was the beginning, not of passion or fire, but of something deeper and stiller, like the slow widening of dawn across the hills. Alenia paused by the hearth. The flames had burned lower, glowing softly. The young shepherd's eyes were half closed, his breath deep and even. "The story goes on," she whispered, but slowly now, like a dream that doesn't hurry to end. She added a log to the fire, which sighed as it caught the flame. Outside, the wind had quieted. Only the night birds called, far away, their notes fading into silence. And the story, gentle as the turning of a page, continued. Days passed. The air grew cooler. Leaves turned copper and gold. And often, Idrin would ride through the valley and find himself near the paths where travelers passed. Once, twice, and then again he met Alara. Always by chance, or so it seemed. Sometimes she was gathering herbs along the stream. Sometimes she sat on a fallen log, sketching plants in a small leather book. Each time they met, they spoke of little things, never urgent. The way the geese flew south, the sweetness of late pears, the quiet wisdom of the hills. And though neither spoke of affection, something gentle and sure was weaving itself between their words, something like trust, or the slow warmth that grows beneath the ashes of a steady fire. The villagers began to notice, of course. They saw the young lord riding with a soft smile, the healer girl pausing to look toward the manor's distant roof. They said nothing unkind, only smiled knowingly, the way old people do when they see spring arriving again. And now, you can take a deep breath. The night outside the manor has deepened. The stars tremble above the dark fields, and the sound of the brook becomes slower, rounder, as if even the water is drowsy. You can feel the calm spreading, as if the world itself is preparing to rest. One evening, as twilight melted into night, Idrin walked to the old oak tree on the hill, the same one beneath which he had once made his quiet wish. He carried a lantern, its flames steady in the windless air. And there, already waiting, was Alara. She looked up and smiled. "I knew you'd come," she said simply. "How did you know?" he asked. "Because the wind told me," she answered, half in jest, but her eyes shone as though she believed it. They sat beneath the tree in silence for a long time. The world was wrapped in silver light. Far below, the village lights flickered like fallen stars. At last, Idrin said softly, I once asked the wind to send me a sign, and since that night, it has always carried your scent of herbs and warm earth. Alara looked down, tracing circles on the grass with her finger. Then perhaps the wind was kind to us both. And that was enough. They did not speak of love, nor vows, nor the future. The land itself seemed to breathe for them, whispering gently through the leaves. And now, the night is getting even quieter. The crickets fade to a slow, steady hum. The air smells of moss and wood smoke. Everything seems to settle, the hills, the house, the hearts of those who listen. Alenia's voice drifted into silence. She looked at the young shepherd, whose breathing had deepened into sleep. She smiled faintly and whispered, and that was only the beginning. Then she leaned back in her chair, letting the firelight play across her wrinkled hands, and closed her eyes. Outside, the first snowflakes of winter began to fall, soft, soundless, infinite. The morning came softly. Mist rolled down from the northern hills and settled in folds across the valley, wrapping trees and cottages in silver. The bells from Marindale's small chapel chimed faintly, each note echoing through the damp air, then melting away into quiet. At the manor, Idrin rose early. He stood at the open window of his room, breathing in the scent of wet earth and apple leaves. The world seemed half asleep, shimmering with dew. In that hush, he thought again of Alara, how she had spoken the night before, how the moonlight had rested on her hair. He did not know it yet, but the next days would bring the old custom the villagers still whispered about, the choosing of the wife. It was not a contest, nor a festival of vanity, but a calm gathering rooted deep in the traditions of the land. It was said that once each generation, when the harvest was stored and the fires of autumn burned low, young men of the valley would walk the ancient road to the Hall of Willow Lights, where they would light candles and leave them at the river's edge. The women who wished to be chosen would follow the river downstream, guided by the flickering glow. But the true choosing was never by hand or eye, it was by heart. The custom held that the man's candle would be drawn toward the woman whose spirit harmonized with his own. Sometimes they found each other in the glow of many lights. Sometimes, no light moved at all. It was an old and quiet way, more of faith than reason. And though the world had grown older, Marindale still kept the memory of it, like a soft hum beneath its daily life. When word reached the manor that the choosing would take place in 3 nights' time, Idrin said little. He only nodded, his gaze drifting toward the distant willow groves. The servants murmured in excitement, polishing his boots, setting aside fine clothes, whispering that their lord would at last have a lady to walk beside him. But Idrin's heart felt still, not eager. He thought of Alara again, her simple cloak, her unhurried manner. He wondered if she even knew of the old ritual, or if she cared for such things. That evening, he went riding to the edge of the forest. The sun was sinking, painting the sky in shades of copper and rose. The air was cool, carrying the scent of drying hay. He dismounted by the brook, tied his horse, and sat upon a stone. The water moved slowly there, smooth as silk. He watched its surface reflect the drifting clouds and said quietly to no one, "If the choosing is meant to show truth, then may the river itself decide." The brook made no answer, but its murmur deepened, a soft sound like a lullaby sung by the earth. Alara, meanwhile, was in her small cottage by the southern woods. She lived simply, a clay hearth, shelves filled with herbs, a small cat who slept near the door. She had heard the villagers speak of the choosing too, in whispers by the well. At first, she smiled and said nothing. She had long thought herself apart from such traditions. Her life was made of quiet things, gathering roots, tending the ill, drying leaves beneath the sun. Yet that night, when she stepped outside and saw the moon rising, pale, round, and kind, she felt a gentle stirring in her chest. She remembered the way Idrin had looked at the hill, his face half lit by the lantern glow. He had said little, but his silence had felt like safety. Alara closed her eyes, listening to the distant river. "If the path leads there," she murmured, "then perhaps I shall follow." And the night wind, soft as a sigh, brushed her cheek as if in answer. The days drifted by like feathers on slow water. Idrin spent them walking through his orchards, touching the bark of trees, letting their silence calm him. He remembered his mother's voice, long ago, telling him that love was not fire but warmth, a steady ember that could last a lifetime. When the evening before the choosing arrived, he walked again to the oak hill. The stars had gathered early, glittering faintly above the valley. In the distance, lanterns were already being lit along the path to the Hall of Willow Lights. Their reflections shimmered on the river like scattered jewels. He stood there a long while, feeling the cool air move through his hair, hearing the slow breath of the earth beneath his feet. The night of the choosing came. The entire valley seemed to move softer, slower, as if the world held its breath. People walked in silence, carrying candles cupped in their hands. The only sounds were the rustle of fabric, the faint splash of water against stones, and the low hum of the wind through the willows. The Hall of Willow Lights was not truly a hall, not anymore. It was a ruin, long reclaimed by moss and ivy. But in the moonlight it seemed whole again, its arches faintly silver, its broken roof open to the stars. Idrin arrived with the others, dressed in a simple dark cloak. He carried a single candle, its wax scented faintly of lavender. He knelt by the river, where dozens of small flames already floated downstream, each carried by a wooden leaf-shaped dish. He lit his candle from one of the village torches, whispered a short blessing, and set it upon the water. The flame wavered, then steadied, moving slowly with the current. He watched it drift away, joining the others, small points of gold moving in silence. Then, according to the custom, he stepped back and waited. Far downstream, Elara stood on the opposite bank. Around her, other women stood quietly, each holding a sprig of willow in her hand. The air smelled of water and smoke. The moonlight rippled over the surface of the river, turning it into a path of liquid silver. One by one, the candles drifted near, some hesitated, circling in small eddies, others passed by. Elara stood still, her hands folded before her, her eyes reflecting the starlight. The water whispered softly around her feet. She could hear frogs singing somewhere close, and the faint creak of a branch overhead. Then, as if moved by an unseen hand, one candle broke from the slow procession. It floated toward her, gliding straight and sure through the current. Elara felt her breath catch. The flame trembled once, twice, then steadied again, and stopped just before her, its light reflected in her eyes. She knelt and placed her hand upon the wooden dish. The warmth of the wax touched her skin, and she smiled softly. "So," she whispered, "you found me." At the Hall of Willow Lights, Idrin stood waiting. The others had already begun to leave, murmuring softly among themselves. Then, from the darkness beyond the trees, a faint glow appeared, a small light moving steadily upstream. He stepped forward. The flame grew brighter, and within it he saw her, Elara, walking slowly, carrying the same candle he had set afloat. Their eyes met, and the world seemed to pause. The river sighed between them. The air smelled of lavender and rain. "I believe this is yours," she said quietly. Idrin took the dish in his hands. The flame, sheltered between them, did not waver. "Then perhaps it was never mine alone," he answered. Neither spoke after that. There was no need. Around them, the night folded softly. The willows swayed like gentle sentinels, and the stars glimmered as if pleased. In the weeks that followed, no great announcement was made. There were no feasts, no songs, only a quiet joining of lives. Elara came to the manor, bringing her herbs and her cat, who soon made the kitchen his kingdom. She planted a small garden by the back door, where thyme and sage grew thickly. The villagers said that since she arrived, the valley smelled sweeter. Idrin, for his part, found his days slower, fuller. He still rode the same paths, tended the same lands, but now there was another voice beside his, humming softly as they walked, or laughing quietly when the geese startled from the pond. At night, they would sit by the hearth, the fire low, their hands intertwined. Sometimes they spoke, often they didn't. It was enough just to be, to listen to the faint chirp of crickets, the sigh of the wind through the apple trees. The old manor, once silent, seemed to breathe again. And now you can take a slow, deep breath. The river stills in your mind. The air is cool and scented with willow leaves. Somewhere, far off, an owl calls once, then grows quiet. Everything begins to slow, preparing for rest. When Alenia's voice paused, the fire in her cottage had burned low. The young shepherd was still there, lying back on the bench, eyes closed, his breathing deep and calm. The old woman smiled faintly. She lifted her cup, sipped the last of her warm milk, and murmured to herself, "That is how it was, or how it might have been. A choosing not of beauty, nor of wealth, but of hearts that breathe in the same rhythm." She looked out the window. The first light of dawn was beginning to touch the frost-covered fields. Smoke curled from a distant chimney. The world, she thought, is always choosing love, quietly, without hurry. And as the fire whispered one last sigh, Alenia closed her eyes, too. The mornings after the choosing were slow and golden. Mist lay low over the valley, and when the sun climbed, it turned the grass to silver. Inside the manor, the hearth was always warm, and the air smelled faintly of bread and herbs. Alara moved through the halls as though she had always been there. She spoke softly to the servants, thanked them for their work, and placed small bundles of dried lavender in every room. "For calm dreams," she would say, smiling. And truly, from that time on, those who slept beneath that roof said their rest grew deeper. Idrin often watched her without words. In the early hours, when the light spilled across the table, he would see her sorting herbs into little clay bowls: rosemary for clarity, chamomile for peace, wild thyme for courage. Her hands moved gently, as though each leaf were something sacred. He had once believed solitude was his truest companion. Now he understood that silence shared could be even sweeter. The autumn lingered. Fields emptied, trees grew bare. In the evenings, Idrin and Alara would walk through the orchards, where the last few apples still clung to the branches. Their breaths rose in small white clouds. The air smelled of earth and wood smoke, and somewhere far away, a dog barked once, then fell silent again. "Tell me," Idrin said one evening, "do you miss the road?" Alara looked up at the hills. "Sometimes," she admitted, "but the road still lives in me. When I walk through these fields, I feel it, like a memory of movement. And then I rest, and I know the road is resting too." He smiled. "Then you've brought the road home." They stood together beneath the trees, saying nothing more. The wind moved gently, carrying the faint scent of cider and fallen leaves. And so the days folded quietly, one into another. They shared their tasks, Idrin mending the fence, Alara tending the garden. Sometimes she would read from her mother's old book of herbs. Sometimes he would tell her the legends his father had told by the fire, tales of rivers that sang, of mountains that dreamed. And in the telling, both would grow still. One afternoon, snow began to fall. First a few flakes, light as breath, then a soft white curtain that hushed the world. Idrin stood by the window, watching the orchard disappear into white. "It feels as though the sky is erasing everything," he murmured. Alara came to stand beside him. "Not erasing," she said, "just giving it a new beginning." He turned to her then and saw that the snowlight caught in her hair, making it glow. For a long moment, they said nothing. The world was quiet except for the gentle ticking of snow against the glass. Winter in Marindale was not harsh, but slow, drowsy, and patient. Days began late and ended early. The villagers kept to their homes, mending nets, spinning wool, sharing stews by the fire. And in the manor, life moved like a lullaby. Each morning, Idrin lit the hearth before dawn. The sound of kindling catching was soft, like a whisper. Alara would wake slowly, the blanket warm against her skin, the faint light trembling on the ceiling. Sometimes she would reach out and find his hand. They would lie there in the half-dark, listening to the world waking. The creak of the beams, the rustle of sparrows in the eaves, the sigh of the wind through the shutters. No words were needed. Their breaths found the same rhythm. And when the day began, she would brew tea, fragrant with honey and mint, and he would bring in logs from the courtyard, brushing snow from his shoulders. Their lives had become simple as a poem spoken softly, a rhythm of small kindnesses, steady and sure. In the afternoons, Alara worked in the little sunroom that looked out onto the frozen garden. She hung herbs to dry, their colors pale but still fragrant: sage, yarrow, marigold. The air in that room always smelled of sunlight, even when the clouds were thick. Sometimes Idrin would come in quietly, not wishing to disturb her. He would sit beside the window with his book, though he seldom read. He simply watched her move. Once, without looking up, she said, "You are quieter than the snow." He smiled. "Then I'm learning from the best." She looked at him then, laughter hidden in her eyes. And for a moment, everything, the room, the light, the scent, felt complete. As the days grew shorter still, the valley slipped into that deep, timeless hush that comes before the year turns again. The river froze at its edges, the trees slept. The only sounds were the low crackle of fires and the distant call of owls. Idrin and Alara spent long evenings by the hearth, the flames painting slow light across the walls. She would mend his gloves while he carved small wooden shapes: birds, leaves, the curve of a sleeping fox. Sometimes they would speak of the past, but more often they spoke of nothing. Their silences were warm, and when night came fully, they would step outside for a moment before sleep. The stars hung close, bright and tender. Their breath rose together in the cold air, fading upward like smoke. "The stars seem nearer in winter," Alara said one night. "Perhaps they come to listen," Idrin answered softly. She smiled. "Then let's not speak too loudly." They stood together beneath that endless sky until their hands grew cold, and then they went inside, the door closing gently behind them. "And now you can take a deep breath. Imagine the quiet of that manor, the low fire, the soft snow falling outside, the stillness wrapping every sound. Let your own breath slow, matching the rhythm of their peace." In early spring, when the first meltwater began to run through the ditches, Alara planted again. She worked in the soil with bare hands, humming softly. Idrin watched from the fence, smiling to see her kneel in the thawing earth, her fingers tracing the beginnings of new life. "You treat the ground like a friend," he said. "It listens," she replied, looking up. "It always does, if you speak kindly enough." And so they tended their land together, as quietly as the growing itself. The days stretched, green returned, and the sound of bees returned to the air. One morning, Alara came into the hall with a small clay pot in her hands. In it grew a thin, delicate plant with silver leaves. "What is it?" Idrin asked. "It's called moonwort. My mother said it grows only where love is at peace." He looked at her for a moment, then took the pot and placed it on the table near the window. The sunlight touched its leaves, making them glow faintly. "Then let it stay here," he said. "It will remind us to keep our peace." She nodded, her smile gentle, her eyes shining softly, like dawn through mist. That night, the manor slept deeply. The river murmured outside, free again of its ice. In the orchard, the first buds trembled beneath the moonlight. Inside, Alara dreamed of water and wind, of the slow pulse of the valley, the same quiet strength she had always felt beneath her feet. Beside her, Idrin dreamed too, though his dreams were simpler. A cottage window opened to the scent of herbs, the warmth of a hand resting in his own. And somewhere beyond dreams, the land itself whispered, slow, eternal, and kind. And now, the night is getting even quieter. You can feel your body growing heavy and still. The story moves slower, softer, like a lullaby fading into distance. The world of Marindale grows dim, but warm, a light still flickering in the window, a hearth still burning for those who wander in their sleep. Everything seems to rest: the hills, the trees, the hearts of those within them. Alinia's voice faltered for a moment. The shepherd, still resting by her fire, had slipped further into dreams. She smiled to herself, stirred the embers, and whispered, "That's how peace finds its home, quietly, like snow upon a sleeping field." Her words drifted upward like smoke, curling into the rafters, until only silence remained. Spring melted quietly into summer, like honey warming in the sun. The valley of Marindale turned deep green, its fields heavy with grass, its orchards heavy with fruit. The river, once cold and sharp with melting ice, now moved lazily beneath the willows, thick with dragonflies and sunlight. At dawn, the air shimmered with birdsong. By midday, the world was silent except for the hum of bees. And when the evening came, it came gently, the light lingering, the air filled with the scent of mint, wild rose, and hay. In those slow months, Idrin and Alara lived almost entirely outdoors. They ate their meals beneath the apple trees, their table a flat stone covered with a cloth, their wine cool from the cellar. Sometimes Alara would hum as she gathered herbs along the fence, her fingers brushing the tall grasses. Sometimes Idrin would lie on the grass, watching the clouds drift across the blue, listening to her quiet movements nearby. They seldom spoke, yet every gesture was full of understanding. A glance, a smile, a shared silence. One warm afternoon, when the air shimmered faintly and the hills looked like they were dreaming, Idrin said, "When I was a boy, I used to think that summer would last forever." Alara smiled, shading her eyes from the sun. "And now I think it does," he said. "It only changes shape." She laughed softly. "That's something only the wise say." He turned toward her. "No, it's something only the peaceful learn." The breeze moved gently between them, carrying the faint sound of a lark. There was a rhythm to their days that summer, gentle, deliberate, unchanging. Each morning, Idrin would ride to the farm meadow to check the fences, returning just as the heat grew heavy. Alara would meet him with a jug of water and a smile. They would sit by the stream, their feet in the cool current, watching the minnows flash beneath the surface. Sometimes, while he rested, she would weave small garlands of herbs, not for show, but for scent: rosemary, lavender, a touch of sage. She hung them by the doors to bless the rooms with calm. And when the evenings came, they would light no candles until the last light faded, letting the dusk enter the house slowly, gently, until the walls turned the color of sleep. And now you can take a soft breath. Feel that slow summer warmth, the hush between one breeze and the next, the soft glow behind your eyelids. Everything stills, yet nothing stops. One evening, as the sun was setting behind the western ridge, the sky turned the color of old peach and smoke. The valley shimmered. The air smelled of wildflowers and the faint sweetness of ripening apples. Alara and Idrin walked toward the river. They followed a path of soft dust, the kind that remembers every footprint until morning dew erases them. The water was calm, reflecting the whole sky. They sat together beneath the willows, their leaves whispering like old friends. "It's strange," Alara said quietly. "When I first came here, I thought the valley was silent. But now I hear how much it says, just very softly." Idrin nodded. "It speaks in rest, I think, in the pauses between things." They sat there a long time, listening to the pauses. The next day brought rain, not a storm, but a warm, slow rain that seemed to fall out of pure kindness. It filled the air with the scent of soil and moss, washed dust from the leaves, and left silver beads clinging to every blade of grass. Alara stood at the doorway, watching it fall. The sky was soft gray, the sound steady and even, like the breathing of the earth. Idrin came behind her, wrapped a shawl around her shoulders, and said, "The land is sleeping while it drinks." She smiled, leaning against him. "Then let's keep it company." They stood there together, saying nothing more, listening to the quiet rhythm of the rain, a rhythm that seemed to wash not only the valley, but their thoughts, until everything felt new again. When the sun returned, the world glowed. The river shone like glass, the fields steamed gently, and the scent of green filled the air. The manor's windows sparkled, the paths were lined with tiny puddles reflecting the sky. That night, Alara walked through the orchard barefoot. The grass was cool beneath her feet, damp and fragrant. She moved slowly, touching the branches as she passed, feeling the life thrumming within them. Idrin watched from the porch. The sight of her, quiet, steady, half hidden by the leaves, felt like seeing peace itself walk through the world. When she returned, he took her hand and said softly, You've made this place alive again. She shook her head. It was always alive. We only learned how to listen. In midsummer, the valley held its small feast of thanks. Not a grand festival, just a gentle gathering by the river. People brought bread, honey, milk, and fruit. They sang quiet songs and lit lanterns that floated downstream, their lights swaying softly in the current. Idrin and Alara went together, sitting at the edge of the crowd. Children laughed nearby, chasing fireflies. Old men smoked their pipes in silence, watching the stars appear one by one. The air smelled of baked apples and cool grass. When it grew dark, Alara leaned her head on Idrin's shoulder and whispered, "It feels as though the night itself is breathing." He looked up at the stars. "It is, and we're part of its breath." As the months moved on, the days began to shorten again, but gently, without sorrow. The first leaves began to fade at the edges. The mornings carried a touch of mist. Idrin and Alara spent long twilights sitting by the window, watching the light withdraw from the hills. They had grown into their quietness, the way trees grow into their roots. Their words were few now, not from distance, but from depth. What had once needed to be said was now simply known. Sometimes, when the crickets began their slow song, Idrin would murmur, "Listen, the valley is telling us to rest." And Alara would smile and answer, "Then we should obey." And now you can breathe again, slower, deeper. The valley grows still in your mind. The air turns softer, cooler, fragrant with ripened fruit and faint wood smoke. The story's rhythm slows even more, as if it too were falling into gentle sleep. That night, long after the lanterns by the river had gone dark, the moon rose, full and golden, laying its quiet light across the orchard. The leaves shimmered, the brook whispered faintly, and in the distance a nightingale sang once before resting. Idrin and Alara lay awake for a time, listening to the small sounds of night, the crackle of cooling stones, the soft wings of a moth brushing the curtain. Alara turned to him and said, her voice barely above a whisper, "Do you think love ever sleeps?" He thought for a moment, then said, "No, I think it dreams." She smiled, eyes half closed. "Then we're inside its dream now." And the house seemed to agree, every sound easing into stillness, every shadow deepening into peace. The world outside the cottage window was fading now in Alenia's telling. Her voice had become softer, almost like the creak of an old chair. The shepherd's head had tilted slightly to one side. His breaths came long and slow. Alenia smiled, stirring the fire with the edge of her stick. Sparks rose and faded like tiny stars. She whispered, "And so the seasons passed over them, not as years, but as blessings." The wind outside turned, brushing softly at the shutters. Her candle flickered once, then steadied again. And the valley, she said, almost to herself, slept content. Autumn did not come suddenly that year. It arrived as a whisper, a coolness at dawn, a hush that settled over the valley like silk. The grass grew pale and sweet. The air smelled faintly of apples and drying herbs. Alara woke one morning to find a light mist lying over the orchard, silver and soft as breath. She wrapped herself in a shawl and walked outside. Each step brushed beads of dew from the grass. The world looked gentler, more thoughtful, as if it had paused to remember something beautiful. From somewhere in the distance came the sound of a bell, slow and measured. It marked the beginning of the harvest season, though no one hurried. Even the crows in the field seemed to speak more quietly, their voices softened by the mist. Inside the house, the hearth was warm again. Idrin had kindled the first morning fire of the season. He stood by it, holding his cup of tea, watching the steam curl upward. Alara came in quietly, her cheeks pink from the air. "Already cold?" he asked gently. She smiled, only enough to make warmth feel like a gift. He reached out and took her hands between his, rubbing them softly. "They say," he murmured, "that every autumn the earth breathes out, gives back what it has held all summer. That's what the mist is." Alara closed her eyes. "Then it's a kind breath. It smells of rest." They stood that way for a long while, neither needing to move. The fire crackled softly, the kettle hummed. Outside, a leaf drifted past the window, spinning lazily downward. As the days turned, the harvest began. The villagers filled their baskets with apples, pears, and late plums. In the fields, golden sheaves stood like tall, silent guards under the open sky. Children laughed faintly in the distance, gathering fallen fruit. And through it all, a deep contentment lingered, the slow satisfaction of work done without haste, the peace of knowing nothing was wasted. Idrin and Alara helped where they could. Sometimes they carried baskets to the press. Sometimes they baked bread for the workers. In the evenings, they returned home with the scent of hay and smoke clinging to their clothes. And when the stars appeared, they would sit on the steps and watch the glow of distant lanterns in the fields, tiny moving sparks that looked like earthbound constellations. One evening, after a long day of quiet labor, Alara lit a small candle on the table. The light shimmered over the clay walls, turning the shadows into soft shapes. Idrin poured wine into 2 cups, and they sat together in silence. Outside, the wind brushed the eaves gently. Somewhere, an owl called once, then again, fainter. "It feels different now," Alara said at last. "The world seems slower, as if it were thinking." Idrin nodded. "It's remembering itself. Every leaf that falls, every stalk that bends. It's the earth's way of saying, 'I've done enough for now.'" She smiled. "Then maybe we should listen to it." And so they did, listening not only with their ears, but with the quiet inside them. And now you can breathe a little slower, as though you too were sitting by that fire. The scent of apples and smoke in the air. The sound of wind turning the pages of the night. Everything softens, even time. The first frost came one morning, almost invisibly. The fields were pale and still. The fences glittered faintly in the dawn. When Alara stepped outside, her breath became a small white cloud that drifted away into the quiet. Idrin was already in the orchard, running his hand over the rim of a barrel. He looked up and smiled. "The frost has silvered everything. It's like the valley's wearing its finest cloak." She laughed softly. "Then it's dressed for sleep." He nodded. "And we'll keep watch while it dreams." They gathered the last of the apples, cool, fragrant, each one shining with a thin film of frost that melted against their palms. The air smelled of wood and sweet fruit, of endings that were gentle, not sad. That evening, as the sky darkened early, they filled the house with quiet light. Candles flickered in the windows. On the table lay bread, honey, and warm milk. They spoke of small things, the coming snow, the way the fox tracks had appeared again near the hedge, the old song the miller's daughter had sung at the harvest feast. Every word was soft, unhurried, half-whispered. Outside, the wind moved gently through the orchard, shaking a few last leaves from the branches. The night gathered around the house like a blanket. And then, one night in late autumn, the storyteller Alina paused. Her fire had burned low, the embers glowing like small hearts in the dark. The shepherd, half asleep beside her, stirred faintly. She smiled, her voice dropping into a near whisper. "Some say that when the last leaf falls in Marindale, a dream passes through the valley, a dream of the days when love was chosen not for beauty or power, but for quiet hearts that understood the earth's song." The wind sighed outside, soft as breath. Alina looked into the firelight and continued. Idrin and Alara had grown old together, but not in spirit. Their faces carried the marks of laughter, not sorrow. Their home was still filled with the warmth of simple things, a loaf on the table, a lamp in the window, the sound of rain against the roof. When travelers passed through the valley, they would stop there for the night. And those travelers would speak, later on, of a peace they could not name, a feeling that lingered even after they'd gone. And now you can feel that peace too. Let it settle around you, like autumn air, gentle and clear. The night grows quieter with every breath. The fire's last glow fades softly, and all that remains is warmth, and the calm, patient rhythm of rest. That night, in the story, snow began to fall. Slowly, soundlessly, over the orchard, over the river, over the sleeping roofs. The world turned white and still, wrapped in its own breathing silence. Inside the house, the candlelight flickered once, then steadied. Alara turned to Idrin and said, "The first snow always makes the world look new again." He smiled, eyes heavy with sleep. "That's how love feels, too." She leaned her head on his shoulder. "Then let's keep it." Outside, the snow kept falling, slow, soft, endless. Each flake landing as if it had searched the whole sky to find its resting place. And the storyteller's voice faded like the last ember in the hearth. "Their story," she whispered, "was not about kings or battles, but about the gentle choosing of two hearts that learned to listen, to each other and to the earth. And in that listening, they found a forever that asked for nothing more." Then she closed her eyes, and the room filled with the sound of sleep, hers and the world's. The first snow of the season had covered the valley in white velvet. No tracks marked the fields. The river moved beneath a thin layer of glass, whispering softly where the water still ran free. Every sound was hushed. Even the crows called more quietly, their voices muffled by distance. The trees stood still, their branches holding a light dusting of snow, like lace. And over it all, the air was full of that deep, sweet silence that comes only when the world is utterly at peace. Idrin and Alara woke to that silence one morning. The fire had burned low, the light from the window pale and clean. She turned her head on the pillow, watching the faint glow of frost along the window's edge. "It's beautiful," she murmured. Idrin smiled, his voice slow and soft. "It feels like time has stopped outside." She reached for his hand beneath the blanket. "Maybe it has, just for a little while." They lay there listening, not for anything in particular, but simply to the quiet itself. It had its own rhythm, as gentle as breath, as patient as snow falling unseen. That day, they did almost nothing. There was no need. Idrin fed the fire and warmed bread by the hearth. Alara stirred a pot of honeyed milk, its scent filling the room with calm sweetness. When she handed him a cup, their fingers brushed. He smiled faintly, the lines at the corners of his eyes deepening like sunlit creases in old fabric. "Do you remember," he said softly, "the spring when you first came here?" Alara nodded. "I remember the light on the river and how nervous you looked when you asked me to walk with you." He laughed under his breath, a warm, quiet sound. "I thought I was asking for a moment. I didn't know I was asking for a lifetime." She touched his cheek lightly. "You didn't ask for it," she whispered. "You built it." And outside, the wind moved gently through the eaves, as if it too were smiling. As days passed, the snow deepened. The world turned soft and muted, colors fading into shades of blue and pearl. Smoke rose from the chimney like a thought drifting upward. In the evenings, they would sit close by the fire, listening to it murmur. Alara would mend clothes, her hands moving slowly, peacefully. Idrin would read aloud from old tales, not for meaning, but for the sound of the words, the music of them. Sometimes they spoke of nothing, simply watching the light dance across the walls. Sometimes he would reach out, place a hand on hers, and say, "I think the valley is asleep again." And she would answer, "Then let it dream kindly. And now you can breathe more slowly. Let the calm of their winter home fill the space around you." The faint smell of firewood, the hush of falling snow, the steady rhythm of two hearts at peace. You are in no hurry. Everything is exactly as it should be. One night, as the fire burned low and the moon cast long beams through the window, Alara rose quietly. She wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside. The world was silver and still. The snow shone faintly under the moonlight. Every sound, was resting. She looked toward the orchard. The trees stood like old friends sleeping side by side. Beyond them, the hills curved gently into shadow. For a moment, she felt as though she could see the breath of the earth, slow, patient, eternal. Idrin joined her at the doorway, his steps soft on the wood. He stood beside her without a word. After a while, she whispered, "I think we're part of the valley's dream now." He smiled. "Then it's dreaming well." They stayed there until their hair and lashes were dusted with frost, until the cold gently urged them back inside. The door closed softly, and the night folded itself around the house again. As the weeks passed, the snow deepened, then slowly began to thin. The sun lingered a little longer each day. The icicles dripping from the eaves made a sound like tiny bells. And with every drop, the earth beneath began to stir. Not to wake, not yet, but to shift softly, like a sleeper turning toward morning. Alara noticed it first. One afternoon she opened the shutters and caught the faintest scent, wet soil, thawing roots, the promise of green. She smiled to herself. "It's coming back," she said aloud. Idrin, half dozing in his chair, opened one eye and said, "It never truly left." And in that moment, time seemed to open like a book, one where every page led quietly to the next. Winter to spring, spring summer, summer harvest, harvest rest. Each season folding into the other, like a heartbeat returning to its rhythm. The story, too, moved toward its rest. In another place, far from that valley, the old storyteller Alenia sat beside her hearth. The fire had burned to a soft glow. Her listener, the shepherd boy, had long fallen asleep, his head resting on his arm, his breath deep and steady. She smiled faintly, her eyes half closed. Her voice was now little more than a whisper in the air. "And so," she said, "they lived quietly all their days. And when the years grew long, their names became part of the valley itself, spoken softly by the wind, remembered in the hush before dawn." The flame flickered once more, then steadied, casting gold over her wrinkled hands. Some say that when the snow falls just right in Marindale, you can still see their footprints side by side, leading toward the river and then fading into the mist. She paused, her eyes warm and far away. "But it isn't a ghost story," she whispered. "It's a memory that doesn't know how to end." The fire settled lower, turning to ash. The room filled with silence again. A kind silence, full of presence. The kind that feels like a blanket being drawn over the world. Alenia leaned back, letting her own eyes close. Outside, snow began to fall again, slowly, softly, endlessly. Each flake found its resting place. Each breath of air turned smooth and still. And somewhere, in that vast quiet, the story folded itself into sleep. And now you can rest too. The story has done what it came to do. There are no more words needed. Only warmth, and peace, and the gentle sound of your own breath. The night is even quieter now. Everything seems to pause. The way the snow pauses in the air. The way dreams hover before they drift away. Let your body grow heavy. Let your mind loosen. And let the world fade softly. Like the last light on a winter's hill. Everything is safe. Everything is calm. Everything is home. And somewhere, beyond thought and time, the valley of Marindale sleeps. Forever quiet. Forever kind.